Well, good afternoon, everybody. I am Stephen Mazza. I am the Dean of the KU Law School. It is my honor to open this year's Law Review Symposium. I want to start by recognizing and thanking Jenny Barton, who is the Law Review Symposium editor this year. Jenny, along with Sarah Buchanan, who is this year's editor-in-chief, they have both done a really terrific job of organizing this year's event, particularly given the current circumstances. These are very resilient and very hardworking students. This year's Law Review Symposium, Accelerating Clean Energy, the Next Decade of Reform, brings together a highly accomplished group of speakers. In addition to Professors Eisen and Powers and Dean Tomain, we have two speakers with close ties to KU Law, Professor Outka, who also serves as our Associate Dean for Faculty, and our former Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and current Dean of the Utah Law School, Elizabeth Kronk Warner. We organize these symposia to share knowledge and expertise about important issues facing society, but we also organize them to support our students. So I want to take a moment and thank all of the speakers. During these difficult times, it would have been really easy to decline to participate because of other obligations, but you took valuable time out of your schedules to be with us today and support our students and support our law school community. And I just want you to know how much we appreciate it. A special debt is owed to Professor Outka, who worked with the Law Review students to put together today's program. And last but not least, I also want to thank Professors Chris Jahuzel and Laura Hines, who serve as the Law Review faculty advisors. They also support our students. And again, we appreciate that. Welcome to all of our guests watching via Zoom. And without further ado, I will turn the program over to our wonderful Associate Dean for Faculty, Outka.
Thank you so much, Dean Mazza. As a member of the KU Law faculty, it's a great pleasure to work with our student scholars on the Kansas Law Review to host this timely and important symposium. It is their interest that is the driving force behind this event, and their work together with the contributing authors who will be writing for the Law Review will result in a symposium volume based on today's presentations. And although we do miss connecting in person, we are so pleased to be able to have with us students, faculty, attorneys, alumni, and others joining us from far and wide. And we extend our warmest welcome to you all. Symposium organizer Jenny Bartos has asked me to offer a few opening remarks on the theme of the symposium, after which I will turn it over to her to introduce the panelists. Here at the start of a new decade, we have reached a point in the renewable energy transition that wind and solar power have become essential generation resources on the electric grid. Last year, wind overtook coal production in 2 states, Kansas and Iowa, making this an especially timely topic for our state. For many Kansans, this renewable energy milestone is a point of pride. Last year, Kansas ranked first among all states for the percentage of electricity generated from wind. We're neck and neck with Iowa. Okay, they pulled ahead a little bit in the last couple of months, but we'll see what happens next year. 1 and 2, very close, points apart. The focus of this symposium, though, of course, is much bigger than our state, and the Kansas Law Review is national in its scope. Even as we may look back over the last decade and recognize significant growth in renewable energy nationwide, it's also clear that the next phase of development will only be more challenging. Current legal frameworks have carried clean energy this far, but are they sufficient to accelerate clean energy development going forward? The fact remains that most electricity is still generated from fossil fuels. Legal frameworks for new energy generation remain fragmented and primarily state and local. New infrastructure frequently faces local opposition, and grid governance is still evolving to accommodate increased intermittent power sources. Against the backdrop of these challenges is the stark warning from the United Nations and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that the next 10 years, 2020 to 2030, is critical for climate change mitigation, for which the shift to clean energy is a central component. The overarching question the symposium will explore then is what reforms are needed in law and policy to accelerate clean energy over the next critical decade. I'd be happy to turn it over to Jenny Bartos now to introduce our panel. I'm absolutely delighted to have all of you here. Thank you so much. And Jenny, take it away.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Dean, as well for that introduction. First and foremost, I just want to reiterate welcome and thank you for coming to the 2020 Kansas Law Review Symposium. On behalf of the entire Kansas Law Review, I want to thank all of our attendees and for taking time out of their day to come listen to these panelists. The Kansas Law Review was first established in 1952, and ever since then, we've published 5 issues, with one of those being the symposium issue. And like Professor Outka mentioned, we wanted to highlight renewable energy development for this issue, and that's what our panelists will be speaking on today. Before we get started, I wanted to do just a few housekeeping things. I see in the Q&A there's some discussion about the format and questions about the Q&A segment. So for the format of this event, each presenter will have 15 minutes to present. I will introduce each presenter as we go along throughout the event. After our final presenter, who is Professor Outka, concludes, she will then lead the panelists in a 45-minute moderated Q&A, and that's when the audience questions that you have asked will be discussed, at least some of them. So for the audience, while you're watching the presentations, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. We'll be monitoring this chat and picking some of them to discuss during that portion. And then finally, closed captioning is provided for this event. To access that closed captioning, you're going to hover over your screen and hit the CC button, and that should enable captions. And again, with that, I want to welcome everyone to the 2020 Kansas Law Review Symposium. So professors, I'm going to introduce now our first presenter, Professor Joseph Tomain. If you all wouldn't mind turning off your video until the time it is for your presentation, and then I will introduce you. Thank you, Dean. And then I will introduce you as y'all are beginning for your presentation. But Professor Tomain, don't go anywhere, because as you know, you are our first presenter. So I am very excited to introduce our first presenter, Professor Joseph Tomain. Professor Tomain is Dean Emeritus and Wilbert and Helen Siegler Professor of Law at the University of Cincinnati College of Law. Professor Tomain was Dean for 15 years and has published in several areas of law, including energy law, land use, regulatory policy, and contracts. With his primary scholarly focus in energy law, Professor Tomain has written numerous books, including his most recent from Cambridge University Press, Clean Power Politics, The Democratization of Energy, and the well-known Energy Law Nutshell, now in its 3rd edition. He is a co-author for a leading energy law textbook and has authored many books, chapters, and articles within the field. When he isn't busy writing, Professor Tomain can be found serving as Chair Emeritus of the Board of the Knowledge Works Foundation, Chair of Knowledge Works, or on the board of the Ohio Justice and Policy Center. Professor Tomain's article is entitled Still Greening After All These Years. And Professor, I'm going to turn it over to you to begin the symposium.
Jenny, thank you very much for that very, very generous introduction. I am going to go to some PowerPoints so that I can hopefully stay within the time limit. Let me go there now and I'll explain the talk. Oh no, has it come up? I can't tell.
Yep, that's perfect.
All right, I'm having a little, here we go. So I hope that's your law school. That's what Google Images tells me. The subtitle is a little anachronistic, which I'll explain in the article in more detail. Still Greening is a reference to this book that celebrates its 50th anniversary this year, written by Charles Allen Reich, a then Yale law professor. It was widely read and heavily criticized at the time, but I remember reading it fondly. and thought that revisiting it might have something to tell us about the current situation we're in and where we're going, and I actually think it does. Now, I'll explain the book in more detail in the article. Suffice it for now to say that the core criticism that Reich levels is that our society, and he's writing 50 years ago, but it's still true today, is wedded to the idea of the corporate state. Now, both words are important. Corporate, of course, indicating the private side, state, of course, representing government and the public side. But it was Reich's point that ever since the New Deal, that public and private sectors have worked largely hand in hand. And this is the value that he identified in his book. I thought that the idea of the state and the corporate world working closely is best exemplified by the privately owned or investor-owned utilities, and my comments are going to go to that. What I'm going to say is that I am arguing that Reich's point that we need to move from a consciousness of the corporate state to something else is in fact happening. That's the thesis of my article, as well as these remarks. At the same time, the focus of my remarks being the IOU is I am going to argue that I think that IOUs are in a bit of schizophrenia about how to behave regarding the clean energy transition. I think there's evidence on both sides. There is no shortage of articles about the utility of the future. A major study is being conducted by MIT, and yet at the same time we see recalcitrance and a reluctance of IOUs to embrace the clean energy transition wholesale, although, as I will argue, they do so in significant part. Now, here is your traditional IOU, and here are some of their current behaviors. You will see IOUs fight net metering. You will see them fight renewable portfolio standards. I have this next bullet, chicanery, and I am referencing there the fact that utilities have bribed officials both in Ohio and in Illinois in order to get legislation passed. The tune of the bribe in Ohio was $60 million. In addition to outright bribery, there are a series of utilities making very questionable political contributions as well as philanthropic contributions to the decision makers to whom they appear before. We don't have IOUs without regulators, and recently we have FERC engaging in, I think, also part of the schizophrenia. They've recently adopted modernization rules for the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act, the point of which was to expand competition by non-utility generators. And the modernization was under the guise that the electric industry has changed dramatically since 1978 when the act was passed. That's true. And a lot of technical changes were recommended and adopted. From the utilities standpoint, those were necessary in order to respond to industry changes. From qualifying facilities, independent power producers, or non-utility generators, these changes made it more difficult to qualify for the protections that PURPA offers. I don't want to go too much into the weeds on that. I think there's truth on both sides. Joshua Macy of Cornell has written a fascinating article that deals with the federal regulation of electric utilities, calling them zombie energy laws, by which he means that there are laws on the books that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission still adheres to, but that retards the expansion of clean energy and retards an energy transition. examples of those laws would be a continued adherence to principles of cost of service regulation, which reward utilities for capital expansion, and the use of certificates of public convenience and necessity to cut off transmission lines from clean energy producers into the grid. So those are two examples that he uses. Even when we have state reform proposals, such as New York's REV, project. Maryland is doing the same. Hawaii is doing the same. Minnesota is as well. Those states are looking at a wholesale review of how energy is delivered in their state systems. And in each of them, the IOU plays a central role. So on the one side, it is business as usual. On the other side, we do have examples of the utility of the future. IOUs are submitting proposals to state regulators that have net zero energy goals, depending upon which utility and which individual resource plan is submitted. The goals will have different years out. 2050 is a popular date for these IRPs. You also have IOUs looking carefully at new technologies, obviously wind and solar at utility scale. And there are pilot projects on virtual power plants. And that phrase is just meant to encompass the idea that utilities can put aggregations of battery users, homeowners largely, into the pot and make them part of their energy portfolio or electricity portfolio, if you will. We are seeing more adoptions and more movements on local energy and the adoption of microgrids. And then even FERC with these two orders, the first dealing with energy storage. We have a new acronym, ESRs, energy storage resources. Let's just call them batteries. But FERC is now integrating storage into the wholesale market. And in the next order, 2222, they're doing the same for distributed energy resources. Let's see. Now, my argument is that in addition to these changes in the industry, that there are movements in the culture, and culture is a key word for Reich. He calls it the new consciousness, or did in the book. But it seems to me that these movements that I've listed in this slide are in fact changing the way we look at energy. It used to be that energy was treated with one set of rules, regulations, and goals, and the environment was treated with another, when in fact the physical reality is that you can't generate energy without environmental consequences, so they must merge. Similarly, it used to be thought that there was a positive correlation between energy and the economy, which is to say that the more energy that was produced and consumed, the healthier the economy would be. Well, that's not true either. In fact, since 1970, according to the Department of Energy, we have increased the amount of energy we get per dollar spent. In other words, our energy efficiency is increasing, and there is a decoupling of that direct and positive correlation between energy and the economy. So part of the new consciousness is to merge energy, the environment, and the economy. In fact, both of the leading energy casebooks do so, and Joel's casebook, in fact, is named that. So this is a different way of looking at energy as not independent from a healthy economy or from being environmentally sensitive. These other movements are more social. The environmental justice movement started about, I want to go 40 years ago, if not more. Robert Bullard was the largest proponent. And his argument was that environmental justice required careful consideration of where projects of any sort were placed that were polluting projects, These dealt with siting, and it was his point, and it's demonstrated over and over again, that it's the poorest communities and communities of color that are the most vulnerable and suffer the consequences of where we put a lot of our projects. Another movement called energy democracy really looks to greater citizen participation and decentralization of the energy sector. And it is independent of environmental justice, but it is consistent with it. Just transition is more of a international movement based upon the idea that if you're going to introduce new technologies and new industries, there may be an impact on jobs, and that jobs must in fact be paid attention to as we go through a clean energy transition. So if you look at these movements, and there are others such as energy justice and climate justice, but environmental justice, energy democracy, and just transition, energy, the environment, and the economy as a whole, as well as be a proponent of a clean energy transition and a clean energy future. And these three movements literally go from the local level to the world stage, if you will. So I know I'm speaking a little quickly. So the question or the subtitle of the symposium was, what's the next decade of reform? And quite frankly, it depends upon November 4th or thereabouts, right? Who wins the November 3rd election. I think if you I don't think I am making any wild predictions to suggest that if we have a Democratic White House and Senate for sure, that you will see elements of the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal incorporates jobs programs, infrastructure improvements, clean energy transition, and the like. I think you'll see a reinvigoration of federal climate initiatives. The Clean Power Plan may be back on the books in some form. The Climate Action Plan that Obama administration had put forth, you may see that. You may see us rejoin the Paris Agreement. Carbon pricing, again, I think that this is a likely event for the next decade, and it is a central part of a clean energy transition. Further funding for clean energy R&D, and you may in fact see federal rules on zero net energy goals. You see it in California now, and as I said, some utilities are moving in that direction as well. So that's one scenario. The next decade of reform is if Biden does not win, and what you will see is a continued subsidization of coal and nuclear power. I think that will fade out, but it will be part of the agenda of the next administration if Biden loses. A further retrenchment of environmental laws. I'm sure you're familiar with these headlines about the 100+ environmental laws that have been rolled back. Most of those have not been upheld by the courts. Nevertheless, significant rollbacks are occurring. We will not have any climate change response, and every year this administration's budget has zeroed out R&D. Congress puts it back in the budget, so you'll see maybe reduced clean energy R&D. So let's see if I know how to get out of this. I'm back. There we go. So that's my sort of thumbnail sketch of what I believe to be significant change in attitude about energy. And that the idea of a clean energy transition is one that is embraced widely. I have focused largely on federal rules, but you're seeing much more movement in the states. And on the private sector, you're seeing significant private investment in the clean energy space and industries. And so if you really put that together, I think the plea for federal involvement is that federal leadership can advance a clean energy transition, whereas right now it is taking no leadership role at all. And that, if we were to see federal leadership, it would not only be on the domestic front, it would be a signal to the world as well that we are serious about such a transition. So with that, I will close and look forward to listening to my colleagues.
Thank you so much, Professor. All right, and now I'm going to introduce our next presenter, who is Professor Melissa Powers. Professor Powers is a Jeffrey Bain Faculty Scholar and Professor of Law at the Lewis and Clark Law School. Professor Powers' research centers on energy reform, climate change mitigation, and pollution control. Professor Powers is the founder and faculty director of the Green Energy Institute at Lewis and Clark, which focuses on developing policies to transition to a zero-carbon energy system. Professor Powers was a Fulbright Schumann Scholar who researched Denmark and Spain's renewable energy laws from 2014 to 2015. Professor Powers is also a co-author of several articles and book chapters focusing on climate and energy law. Her article is entitled Beyond Natural Gas, Lessons from the Beyond Coal Movement to Prevent Natural Gas Lock-in. And here is Professor Powers.
Thank you. I just somehow managed to lock myself in the wrong thing. So give me half a second here while I try and escape while I was trying to prepare for this.
No worries, technology is tricky.
No, my computer does not seem to want me to escape. Okay, there we are, sorry. Okay, sorry about that. Thank you. I want to start first just by thanking Kansas Law Review and Professor Outka, as well as Jenny Bartos, who's been really amazing in terms of helping organize the symposium. I'm very happy to be a part of this symposium. So I write and I teach a lot about renewable energy, but my presentation is going to focus on how we need to deal with natural gas as we seek to accelerate clean energy over the next decade. I'm first going to talk about why we have to address natural gas now, in particular to avoid the problem of infrastructure lock-in. As I'll show, our recent investments in natural gas infrastructure have already been significant, and they could present a substantial barrier to the necessary near-term decarbonization as well as long-term decarbonization we need to achieve. I'm then going to consider these barriers in light of the remarkable transformation that we've seen in the coal sector, and I'm going to discuss some of the lessons that we might take from the Beyond Coal movement, which helped to contribute to a very rapid decline of coal-based electricity in the United States. In discussing the lessons that we can learn, I'm going to highlight both some of the Beyond Coal campaign successes, as well as some of its shortcomings. And then I'll briefly conclude by acknowledging that the transition from natural gas is arguably going to be more complicated, but that the successes with the coal transition present many opportunities for us as we envision a viable and robust clean energy future. So first, why am I talking about fossil fuels in a clean energy symposium? And the short answer is that despite significant, albeit inconsistent efforts to decarbonize our energy systems, we still consume a great deal of fossil fuels, and a fair amount of our transition from coal has involved a transition to natural gas. And although our deployment of renewable energy resources has also expanded significantly since 2010, we have built a lot of new natural gas capacity. This graph, for example, shows us how the fortunes of coal and natural gas in the electricity sector have reversed. When gas first surpassed coal in the electricity system in 2016, this was seen as a major transition point. And that's proven to be true, as we can see steady declines throughout 2020 for coal and steady increases for gas. But we need to look beyond just the electricity sector to understand the massive role that fossil fuels play in our energy systems and indeed in our economy. Fossil fuels still account for about 80% of our electricity supplies, and both gas and petroleum have since about 2010 seen their shares increase. I'm going to note briefly that petroleum is used almost exclusively in transportation, so it won't be a big focus of what I'm going to be talking about. But as we can see, gas has multiple uses as a fuel for electricity production. It's also an industrial fuel source. It's used as a liquid fuel. It's a source of heating and cooking fuel in our buildings and residences. And although it's not depicted here, natural gas is also gaining a foothold as a raw material for plastics. So based on our existing current energy supplies, as well as our forecasted policies, our forecasted energy future is still heavily dependent on fossil fuels. The graph on the right shows that we are projected to expand our renewable energy resources through 2050, which is great. But the graph on the left shows that our existing policy and economic landscape, if they are not adjusted, will mean more growth of natural gas and a substantial remnant of coal through 2050. Although, by the way, these forecasts are frequently wrong, they often understate the performance of renewables and the stability of coal. It is nonetheless the case that without substantial policy changes, we are going to have a lot of gas in our future. This, in part, is because we've built a lot of gas already, as these two images show. Just to note, natural gas is represented by the brown bars in the upper left image and by blue bars in the upper, or the bottom right. And just as an aside, I do not understand why the Energy Information Administration continually changes colors of different resources. It's very annoying, but just a lesson that you have to look at the graphs closely to understand what resource we're talking about. In any event, the top image depicts capacity additions, meaning new natural gas plants that were built and added to the electricity system through 2015. And the bottom right slide takes us through 2019 for actual additions, as well as for energy projections out through 2050. So as we can see in the bottom right, the future growth of natural gas in the electric sector is projected to be much smaller after about 2026 or 2027. But based on the existing additions and the continued additions of natural gas, we are projected to have a great deal of natural gas in our electricity system out through the middle of this century. So why is this a concern? And why do I argue that we have to address this natural gas lock-in problem quickly and strategically? And the short answer is climate change. Global average temperatures have increased by about 1 degree Celsius in comparison to our pre-industrial temperatures. And we are already witnessing unprecedented and accelerating consequences. Just as a few examples, last month was the warmest September on record. Wildfires this summer alone and into the fall have been unprecedented in terms of their severity and scope. And the pollution from them was so bad that it caused multiple cities in the Western United States and Western Canada to effectively shut down for more than a week. The Arctic is melting at an increased rate, as are the Greenland ice sheets. And we, of course, are seeing intensified hurricanes and other types of tropical storms throughout the world. We are only at the beginning of the consequences of climate change, and these consequences will get worse if we do not mitigate the climate risk And part of mitigating that risk is addressing natural gas emissions. So based on the impacts that we've already seen, many climate scientists believe that we need to try to limit our temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius. In order to have about a 50% chance of achieving these goals, we have to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by about 50% within a decade. And then we need to eliminate fossil fuel-based greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And then we need to remove our excess carbon dioxide through things like forest sequestration. These are very ambitious needs for us to ultimately protect against the worst consequences of climate change. Now, the good news is that although these are ambitious, every climate model actually shows that it's possible if we act quickly. And every reasonable climate model shows that the way that we will prevent runaway climate change is by completely decarbonizing our electricity system and moving into an approach called electrify everything. The electrify everything model means that we have to move as much of our energy system, including most of transportation and heating, into the electric system, which we then need to decarbonize and make as efficient as possible. But as I'll return to in just a few minutes, when we think about efficiency, we need to refine our approach to the efficiency argument. Now let's talk a little bit more first about what we mean by electrify everything. This graphic depicts what an electrified everything home would look like. In this home, all of the consumptive devices, vehicles, water heaters, space heating, etc., are electric. This promotion of all electric devices, by the way, is relatively new. And it arose from a couple of articles referred to as the beneficial electrification approach. Now, beneficial electrification refers to the fact that for many years there's been a push to use natural gas furnaces and water heaters and other end-use devices because they were considered to be more efficient system-wide than electric ones. But the electrify everything idea challenges that value of efficiency as a viable end goal when efficiency results in continued use of fossil fuels, because that means we're still going to be emitting greenhouse gases. Electrify everything doesn't focus on efficiency for efficiency's sake. Instead, it focuses on decarbonization. And by focusing on decarbonization as an end goal, that means that natural gas is not going to play a role at the end use, and it's going to play a much smaller, if any, role upstream at the power plant sector. In fact, as this image shows, the electrify everything approach could allow for much greater renewable energy penetration and system reliability. Now, normally renewable energy is perceived to present reliability challenges because the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. One solution to this is to build, and has been, to build a bunch of natural gas plants to dispatch electricity when renewables aren't available. But that won't help with decarbonization. So another solution is to integrate much more storage into our electricity system. This means adding not only big storage assets like pumped hydropower and utility scale batteries, but also adding smaller storage and flexible consumptive devices like hot water heaters, which can store heat for hours even if electricity supply has been disconnected or shut off for a period of time, as well as electric vehicle batteries and other smaller devices. By having an integrated electrify everything approach, we can ultimately integrate far more storage, but this ultimately challenges the use case for natural gas. Now, what is the use case? In summary, natural gas investments have been justified in part on 3 grounds. One, in terms of natural gas appliances, which I just have mentioned, is that they're considered to be more efficient than electric ones. 2, more recently, natural gas began to be promoted as a lower cost bridge fuel that would enable a transition from high emitting coal to lower emitting renewables. And 3, more recently, natural gas power plants have been developed in part to help balance electricity supply from the intermittent renewables. But the problem with these cases is that with gas plants now providing about 40% of our electricity generation, whatever balancing role they might play or bridge role they might play has to be contested. In fact, we've now locked in a great deal of natural infrastructure. And if we don't figure out how we're going to prevent both new investments and build outs, as well as to equitably transition away from existing resources, we're not going to meet our climate goals, and that may contribute to unacceptable economic losses and social disruption. So we need to be thinking about how we can transition away from natural gas. And to inform this transition, we should be thinking about the lessons we can learn from the Beyond Coal movement. So I'm going to whip through some of these lessons because I know I'm out of time as I see Jenny there. So I'll be very quick here. But the first lesson, just to note, is that it is in fact possible to see big changes in our electric system. The circled area in this graph is a depiction of new coal build-outs that occurred in the early 2000s. And the reason I've circled this is because there were, in the early 2000s, nearly 200 new units proposed for construction. And ultimately, through an aggressive campaign that focused on advocacy and litigation at multiple levels of multiple agencies, the new rate of coal capacity additions was actually far smaller than it was initially expected to be, as utilities sought to add a bunch of coal in the 2000s when they thought that they would be able to sneak in before climate regulation was put into effect. So first lesson is big changes in fact are feasible. The second lesson is to emphasize that the Beyond Coal campaign wasn't focused just on using one or a handful even of tools or participating in only one or a few fora. They participated at the litigation level, they participated in administrative proceedings federally before public utility commissions, they advocated for regulations, and they even participated in local activities, for example, to try to prevent the expansion of coal by rail systems. So full spectrum advocacy can be a useful approach to preventing new emissions from taking hold. The third lesson is that they also focused on the alternatives. And this is something that Electrify Everything aims to do. It aims to look into the future to say this is what's feasible, and imagining a zero emitting electricity sector is something that really takes hold of people, much like the images of lots of solar power does. Now with the Beyond Coal movement, at the beginning, they embraced natural gas as the alternative. This was a viable strategy in the early days because natural gas was promising to be cheaper than coal. But that's another lesson that we need to take away from the Beyond Coal movement, which is when you're promoting an alternative system, you should do so hedging where you're not entirely sure about what the downsides might be. And I have this picture up from the Breakthrough Institute. It issued a report called Coal Killer that was very, very promotional of natural gas, and it didn't really acknowledge the downsides. And over time, that actually diminished the credibility of that organization among a number of clean energy advocates because they were so gung-ho on natural gas without recognizing either the lock-in implications or the long-term emissions impacts of natural gas. And we've begun, in fact, to see, as pictured in the bottom right, a big pushback against using natural gas as a bridge or promoting it in any way. The last lesson I wanted to emphasize in terms of the Beyond Coal campaign is our need, and Joe mentioned this in his presentation, to really be thinking now about what a just transition looks like. This really didn't happen in the coal sector, and frankly, it would have been really easy for us to plan a just transition for that industry. In 2003, there were only about 70,000 jobs. And with 70,000 jobs, we could have paid off every existing coal worker for the remainder of their expected employment term, paid for their health care, and paid for their retirement at a much lower cost than the externalized costs associated with burning coal. We didn't do that, and that has caused a great deal of social disruption. And of course, as Joe mentioned, it's delayed politically our transition away from coal. Natural gas is going to be harder. There are many more workers, and we've built up a lot more new natural gas facilities. So we need to be thinking strategically now about how we are going to transition a significant industry away from using fossil fuels and towards our electrify everything economy. But with that cautionary idea in mind, I want to end with a positive note, which is to say that, as I mentioned in the beginning of the 2000s, it looked like we might add a substantial amount of coal capacity. And in 2008, coal supplied nearly 50% of our electricity supply. And this year, it's 20%. And this just shows that with a strategic and comprehensive campaign, as well as with promotion of good alternatives, we can actually effectuate meaningful change. Thanks very much for your time, and I look forward to any questions or comments when we get to that part. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Professor. Perfect. All right, and now I am very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Professor Joel Eisen. Professor Eisen is a professor at the University of Richmond School of Law. Professor Eisen's scholarship focuses on energy law, administrative law, the law of clean and renewable energy, and environmental law. Professor Eisen is a co-author of the book, Energy, Economics, and the Environment, the leading law and business school textbook on energy law. In 2011, Professor Eisen's article, Residential Renewable Energy by Whom?, was named by Vanderbilt Law School and Environmental Law Institute as one of the top 4 environmental articles of that year. We are extremely grateful to have Professor Eisen join us today and for you all to hear about his article entitled COVID-19's Impact on Renewable Energy Development. Without further delay, here is Professor Eisen.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Jenny, for that kind introduction. And good afternoon to the 100 plus of you who are out there who none of us can see because of the constraints of this webinar, but I know you're out there, and we would all love to hear from you in Q&A at the end of this panel. I would also be remiss if I didn't thank all of my fellow panelists and Professor Outka, who are really renewable energy royalty. You're talking about people who have been looking at issues associated with renewable energy for decades combined among my fellow panelists. And thank you especially to Professor Outka for her leadership in putting this together, and to Jenny for tirelessly reminding us what needed to be done along the way. My aim is actually relatively narrow, relatively straightforward. We're talking about accelerating renewable energy's growth over the next decade and beyond. Melissa is talking about moving away from the idea of natural gas as a bridge fuel. Joe talked about policies that could be in place in a Democratic administration and beyond. These are amazing, important developments, as Melissa just pointed out. The transformation, even in recent years, has been substantial. But we're in the middle of a pandemic, and that pandemic has thrown everything about society out the window. And so I wondered for this symposium whether it has had an impact on renewable energy development. The picture is a bit mixed. There are some ways in which the growth of renewable energy has actually stepped back a bit, but there are also other more promising silver linings, you might say, during the pandemic. At the end of this, I'll have some policy prescriptions that you might think of as short-term policy prescriptions, with an eye forward, looking forward to possible stimulus legislation in a new Democratic administration. I'm recommending some policies that should be part of a green stimulus. Again, this is policy for the near term. This is not policy for the next decade and beyond, and so I apologize in advance for going past the symposium's call to think about policy in the next decade and beyond. I'm talking more about the short term. Let me share my screen. We'll get going from there. So the pandemic has set back the renewable energy sector's pace of growth, and there has been a drop in project installation numbers with job losses that are absolutely horrifying. I have some data from just this past week to show you how much of an adverse impact there has been in the clean energy sector. There's been a more challenging environment for financing renewable electricity projects. I'll talk about why that is. And then something of an interesting silver lining, because people were staying home during the pandemic, electricity demand in the aggregate went down, and that created a better competitive environment for renewable power. But when we think of a better competitive environment, we're thinking in terms of projects that are already here on the ground. So let's start with the basics. As everybody has said, there was, before the pandemic, a very long period of growth for renewable electricity. Melissa has documented how coal's share of electricity generation has dropped off the table in the past decade. Much of that is due to natural gas, but a lot of that is also due to the growth of utility scale wind and solar. And there are a number of ways in which renewable electricity is dropping in cost and becoming more cost competitive with fossil fuel generation. And it is the case right now that renewable energy projects are competitive at the very least with peaking natural gas plants. The advent of storage, which both of our previous panelists have referred to, may help that even still further. We know that governmental policies have prompted growth of renewable electricity, but still more is needed to meet climate goals. And I say electricity because we could have a discussion about COVID-19's impact in the transportation sector, but it's a very different impact, in part because it's difficult to substitute fuels in transportation. Airplanes don't yet run on solar, and so the impacts in transportation are quite a bit different. I tend to focus more on the electric power sector. What we've learned is that there has been a reversal in that aggressive growth pattern of renewable electricity. In part, if you look at the bottom of this slide, there has been substantially less solar capacity installed due to the pandemic, and the residential sector in particular has been the hardest hit. This is actually not terribly surprising. A number of states had lockdown orders at the beginning of the pandemic, and those laws halted or slowed down construction projects. Renewable energy projects were typically not deemed essential. There were also challenges involved in the supply chain for renewable energy components, as demonstrated on the right-hand side of this slide. One thing we did notice is that stay-at-home behavior from lockdown orders created overall lower consumption of electricity. There was more residential consumption of electricity. Everybody stayed at home and ran their computers more, as we are now. But that was more than offset. The increase in residential demand was more than offset by a dramatic drop in commercial and industrial demand. And in the upper left-hand corner, you see that in every single one of the power regions in the United States, except for Texas, oddly enough, there was a decrease in peak electricity demand at the beginning of the pandemic. This had another interesting impact. It not only was demand lower, but the load curve flattened out. And I could go get very wonky on this, but the basic idea was that the peak demand times during the day were shifting and flattening out. There is a big peak ordinarily, for example, in the morning when people are going off to work. With fewer people going off to work, there was a less electricity demand at those times in the morning. And every day is like Sunday in a place like Spain, which this chart illustrates. This has lasted even after the lockdown orders have ended. In September, there was a 7% drop in demand year over year in a number of the major regions, with the New York ISO seeing 4 to 5% lower demand at peak times. What this has done in turn is change electric wholesale prices in the various regions. The prices on the average are lower, and that means that more renewable electricity is clearing the market. But again, you have to look at this as more renewable projects that are out there now, already built, the utility scale solar and wind that Melissa was talking about, though they are clearing the market. The environment for new projects is very different, as I'm going to get to in a moment. And there are people who are projecting that electricity demand may not recover for years. The most notable prediction is from the California Energy Commission, which projects decreased demand for the next 2 years. There are some people who believe that demand may not recover until at least 2025. One other thing that happened during the beginning and middle of the pandemic was that there were financing challenges, that money for new renewable energy projects was less available than it is before. I've noticed in the Q&A we have some folks who are project developers. They may know more about this than I do, but I do know that there was a shortfall of money because there was uncertainty about the extension of the federal tax credits, which are due to sunset, but also there were fewer investors who were interested in what's called tax equity financing, a very popular means of financing renewable energy projects. On top of that, banks became more conservative during the pandemic. These charts show a tightening of lending standards in a wide variety of different ways in the underwriting process for commercial and industrial loans. And so banks have, for example, demanded more certainty about the extension of the tax credits from their borrowers, and have increased rates and had tighter conditions than they had before. One very unfortunate impact of the pandemic is on jobs in the renewable energy industry. Before the pandemic, a number of occupations connected with clean energy were some of the fastest growing occupations in the country. The Bureau of Labor Statistics called wind turbine service technicians the single fastest growing occupation between 2019 and 2029. Well, that was 2019. Jobs were increasing at the time. The pandemic had a dramatic and serious impact on jobs in the sector. There have been job losses in the hundreds of thousands during the pandemic. And as you can see from the snapshot at the bottom, which was taken just this past week, only 12,000 of those hundreds of thousands of jobs have been recovered. This industry has been particularly slow to rebound, and even more worrisome, the unemployment in the sector is highest among Black and Latinx workers. So, what to do? Well, part of the prescription here for bringing us out of the pandemic and renewable energy has to do with the policies that are long-term policies that will get more projects started and going. And so I don't want to minimize that. I think that Melissa and Joe have done a great job of talking about the longer term and what we need to do over the longer term. So the question is, what should we do right now? What is a short-term policy right now to do something about these impacts during the pandemic? The first one is relatively straightforward and obvious. A number of people have called for the extension of the federal tax credits, the production tax credit and the investment tax credit, which are due to sunset in the next couple of years. the reason for this is relatively straightforward. Projects have been delayed for the reasons that I mentioned earlier about delays in construction and delays in obtaining components. And so pushing out the sunset deadline to the future would account for the fact that projects have been delayed. It would also have a beneficial impact on unlocking some of the financing that is, at the very least, uncertain at the moment. The tax credits have been an extremely beneficial means of promoting investment in this sector. The need to do so is even more apparent now, given the impacts of the pandemic. I mentioned green stimulus at the beginning. We've had massive stimulus impact efforts so far, of course. We've spent trillions of dollars. The big problem, though, is that much of the stimulus has been done without any real impact, without any real attention to promoting a green economy. And I'll come back to that in a second. In the short term, let's avoid policies that would make the problem worse. Joe mentioned the utilities that are fighting net metering. There was a petition before FERC in July to effectively end state net metering. This is the kind of thing that would move us even further backward. Back to that green stimulus for a moment. There were a number of reports that came out in the beginning of the pandemic that showed that green stimulus impacts can actually have a salutary impact on bringing the economy back. Unfortunately, we're behind the rest of the world in doing this, in the efforts that we've done so far. And what we could do in a green stimulus is include green job training, apprenticeships, retrain workers in industries that have been harmed to do things like repair solar panels. And this could invest in underserved communities that have been hit hardest by the pandemic. We have evidence from labor economists that suggests that green stimulus efforts are in fact quite effective. We have a number of studies that have studied the stimulus programs that were included in the 2009 Stimulus Act that have showed that training programs in particular improve the effectiveness of subsidies that are given out for individual projects. On the other hand, there is some concern that if we're talking about workers who don't have the skill set to come to green energy jobs, it can be difficult to train them. And so what the research has showed is that if you retrain workers who have some of the skills that are needed for green energy jobs, as this scattershot plot shows on the right, that this tends to be more effective. So I think in the near term, I'm calling for 3 different policies. The first one is actually avoiding bad policies, but including job training and worker programs in stimulus bills would go a very, very long way toward not only helping us recover from the pandemic, but also toward accelerating renewable energy growth, which after all is the focus of this symposium. So I see that Jenny's back on the screen now, and I'll stop there. I would love to answer questions about this or any other topic related to this when we get going. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Alrighty, the next presenter I'm going to introduce is Elizabeth Dean Kronk-Warner. Dean Kronk-Warner is the Dean and Professor of Law at the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. And I know our Dean mentioned it, but for those who missed it, Dean Kronk-Warner used to be with us at KU. So we are thrilled to have her virtually back at Green Hall with us. Dean Kronk-Warner is an expert in the intersection of environmental law and Indian law and has written over 40 articles and book chapters about this area. She has also served as an appellate judge for the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. While at KU, Dean Kronk-Warner was the director of the Tribal Law and Government Center. She also chaired KU's Faculty and Staff Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Dean Kronk-Warner's article is entitled Renewable Energy Development in Indian Country. And with that, I will turn it over to Dean Kronk.
Thank you, Jenny, and Boshu Anishinaabe. Hello, friends. It's really wonderful to be with you here today. I see several former colleagues and students who are participants, and I'm delighted to have this chance to talk with you about an important topic. I also want to thank Dean Maza, Dean Outka, and the KU Law Review, in particular Jenny Bartos, for including me today. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here, even if we can't be in person. My pronouns are she and hers, and I'm really excited today as I share my screen to share with you something new that we have here at the University of Utah that we just adopted on Monday for Indigenous Peoples Day, which is our new tribal land acknowledgement statement. So this is actually my first opportunity to use this tribal land acknowledgement statement. I always like to start presentations by acknowledging that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, which is where I'm currently located here in the Salt Lake Valley, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and the urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. So I'm excited that this is my first opportunity to officially use our new tribal land acknowledgement statement. So as Jenny mentioned, my topic today is renewable energy development in Indian country, and I think it builds really nicely on the past presentations that we've heard today. So first, I think we start off with this question of why renewable energy in Indian country? Why should we care about Indian country? And I think these are some interesting statistics. So the National Renewable Energy Laboratory estimates that there's over 17 billion kilowatts per year of solar energy potential and 535 billion of wind energy potential. Now, it is important to note, I'm going to focus on only the lower 48 states, and that's because the laws that affect Alaska Natives in Alaska and Native Hawaiians in Hawaii are very different and deserving of a separate conversation. So I am going to focus on the lower 48. If all of the renewable energy resource sources in Indian country were developed, that would be greater than the amount that currently is being developed in the United States. So that's all to say that we should care about Indian country and development in Indian country because there's a great potential. And also because potentially, as we'll see and we'll talk a little bit later on, there may be reasons to prefer such development in Indian country. So what are we going to talk about today? I wanted to talk just by giving a brief overview of tribal sovereignty, Indian country, tribal regulatory authority, how it's a little bit different than the schemes that other presenters have chatted about. Also why there might be interest in renewable energy development in Indian country, some obstacles that many developers and tribes have faced, some examples of some success stories, which shows that it is possible to overcome these obstacles. And then we'll conclude in terms of the theme of moving forward for the next 10 years of what are some things that potentially we could reform in order to help improve renewable energy development in Indian country. So first, let's start with our foundation and talk a little bit about tribal sovereignty, Indian country, and regulatory authority in Indian country. So first, tribal sovereignty, it's important to recognize and note that tribal inherent sovereignty persists still to this day. So tribal sovereignty is based upon the rights and responsibilities that citizens of tribes have given to their tribal governments, and it predates the formation of the United States. And so for that reason, tribes are separate entities from the United States. And so while it's possible that Congress and the federal government could enact policies that impact tribes, they must deliberately say so in order for such policies to apply. It also means that tribes still possess authority to regulate, especially their members within Indian country. And so that can become important when we're talking about renewable energy development in Indian country. Second, why do I keep using that term, Indian country, and what does it mean? So Indian country is a legal term of art that refers to 3 types of lands. It includes Indian reservations, which is inclusive of rights of way, which will become important when we talk about one of our obstacles to renewable energy development in Indian country. It also includes allotments, which is also going to be important to a discussion of one of our obstacles. So at the end of the 19th century, several federal statutes, including the General Allotment Act, were passed with the idea of dividing up tribal lands and giving the lands to individual owners. And as a result, when you're dealing with development in Indian country, it can be complicated because you could have numerous different property owners who all have property interests within Indian country as a result of those allotment acts from the end of the 19th century. Regulatory authority in Indian country is a little bit different as well. As I mentioned, tribes have their strongest regulatory interest over their citizens located within tribal territories. There is a presumption against tribal regulatory authority over non-Indians on non-Indian land. However, that presumption can be overcome, and that's a decision from 1981, United States versus Montana, where the court held that the presumption can be overcome if the entity agrees to tribal regulatory jurisdiction. And interestingly, in terms of energy development, some tribes are requiring that of non-tribal parties that come into the reservation to do development, such as the Navajo Nation. In order to obtain a permit, you must agree to the Navajo Nation's jurisdiction. The second is if the actions of the non-natives threaten the health, safety, or welfare of the tribe. So obviously, anytime we're talking about the environment, energy development, it does have the potential to impact the health and safety of the tribe. And so the tribe may have regulatory authority under that second Montana exception. So what are the obstacles to effective development in Indian country? So first, and I do want to know, I'm not going to spend too much time on state obstacles. It's not that the state doesn't play a role in energy development. Certainly the state will require or have oversight over the rates that are applicable, and oftentimes in order for interconnection to occur off of the reservation to bring the energy generated off of the generation, that's going to involve states. But the state role really ends at the boundary of the tribe. As the states have very little role traditionally in Indian country. And that's why I'm not focusing too much on the states. Although certainly states do play a role in this type of development, as we heard from some of our other presenters today. So one of the first obstacles is a lack of adequate financial and policy incentives. So on the financial side, we've heard a little bit about the importance of tax incentives, and the majority of these federal tax incentives simply do not apply in Indian country because they do not apply to non-taxable entities. And because tribal governments are governments, they are non-taxable entities. And so as a result, we're going to see that the impact of that is that because the majority of tribes are unable to take advantage of these development incentives, they have been relegated to the status of lessor. Essentially, all that they can do is lease their land out and not take an active role in the development or the management of the renewable energy development within their territory. Similarly, there have been some recent policy initiatives, specifically the TERRA and the Hearth Act. So under the TERRA Act, the idea there was that tribes could engage in environmental development outside of the normal federal regulatory approval process if they had a preceding agreement with the federal government. However, since that provision went into place in 2005, to my knowledge, no tribe has engaged into a TERRA agreement. And there's a lot of reasons why, but it's essentially been a failure. Similarly, there was the Hearth Act, which was enacted in 2012, which was meant to decrease burdensome leasing regulation. Similarly, approximately 20 to 30 tribes have taken advantage of this, but we haven't seen widespread tribal participation of the 500 plus federally recognized tribes in the United States. So it simply has not been persuasive. Also, there's a lack of necessary infrastructure. So oftentimes tribes are located in rural communities, especially the communities that have abundant wind and solar resources. And so therefore, because they're not close to a large urban center, the transmission lines to get the energy produced into those urban centers simply do not exist. And they're incredibly expensive, not only, and also regulatory burdensome to develop those transmission lines, which makes it really difficult to get the energy outside of Indian country. There are also burdensome leasing and rights of way provisions. So because the federal government plays a role in Indian country, and this actually goes back to an 1823 decision, Johnson v. McIntosh, where the US Supreme Court held that the federal government owns in naked fee simple the trust land for tribes, and tribes have beneficial interest. So because of that federal ownership interest, the federal government has to approve these leases. You couple that with oftentimes it's very difficult to determine rights of way within Indian country because of that fractionated land interest that I mentioned from the General Allotment Act, and it can become very difficult to determine leases and to establish these types of projects within Indian country. However, despite these obstacles, there are some success stories, and I put the question mark there because success according to whom? As we'll go through this, tribes have been successful in having renewable energy projects developed within their territories, but they haven't always been successful in having an ownership or a management role. So if you determine success by merely looking at the existence of these projects, yes, there has been successes. But if we want to determine success and judge success by the role of the tribes, we have not seen a lot of renewable energy development that centers tribal sovereignty. And that's important because a seminal Harvard project on economic development in Indian country found that in order to have truly successful economic development, you need to have development that centers both tribal sovereignty and the protection of cultural resources. And if the tribe is relegated to this status as a lessor, that's not necessarily going to happen. But here are some success stories. So we certainly have the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation has been engaged in both smaller and larger scale projects. So both in terms of providing solar and small scale wind installations for its community, which overwhelmingly many communities in the Navajo Nation do not have electricity. But they're also looking to create larger projects such as the Kiente Solar Project, which would provide electricity directly into the grid as a method of diversification. And the Navajo Nation has had success so far with its projects. And so it's recently announced its interest in developing an even larger project at the PBS Ranch. And the state of New Mexico has indicated its willingness to support this development so that the development can help the state reach its own renewable energy goals. Here's a picture of that first kind of commercial scale solar development project that the Navajo Nation engaged in. Next, we have the Campo Band. The Campo Band is notable in that it has the largest commercial scale project to date, which is a wind project. It has tremendous wind resources, but here's an example of where I put the question mark on success, because the tribe wanted to develop its wind energy itself, but was unable to do so because of the lack of financial incentives. And so as a result, was relegated to the position of having to merely lease its land to a non-tribal third-party investor. So yes, certainly ample wind energy development here, but one can question as to whether or not this is a success from the tribe's perspective. In fact, the tribe was unhappy with this arrangement and attempted to have a second project, but that second project was not successful because of the lack of federal incentives. We can also look at smaller projects. For example, the Blackfeet Nation had a single wind turbine that it was able to put up. And although not large scale in terms of selling electricity generated into the larger grid, it was successful in providing electricity for the tribal college. So certainly from the tribe's perspective, a win. We also have solar PS systems, that the Kiowa Pueblo has looked into developing. And here too, it's a good example of where it's a smaller project in terms of the electricity benefiting the tribe, but it certainly has been very beneficial to the tribe overall. The last example of a smaller project that I'll give is the Mwapa Microgrid Project, which was announced in 2017. It's a 250 MW solar plant located within tribal lands. And despite significant obstacles, they were able to overcome, similar to the Campo structure where the tribe is the lessor for the first 10 years, but then the tribe negotiated that the expiration of those federal tribe incentives, tax incentives, that the tribe would have an ownership and management interest. So kind of a building on the Campo experience to the next level. And here's a picture of that. So concluding thoughts, where do we go in the next decade? What happens between 2020 and 2030? I think if we're going to take advantage of these renewable sources in Indian country, there are a couple things that need to happen. First, we need to see a development that really centers tribal sovereignty, because as we saw in the Campo example, even though the installation was successfully started, it was not deemed a success from the tribe's perspective. So that all partners are happy with the project, it's really important to center that tribal sovereignty. Secondly, clearly the federal tax incentive schemes need to be changed to allow for greater tribal participation. And also, so that we can have truly effective and successful collaboration, it is encouraged that industry reach out, and work with tribes as true partners rather than lessors. So with that, Chamagwitch, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dean Kronk Warner. All righty. And our final presenter this afternoon is going to be Professor Outka, who is also the faculty sponsor for the symposium, and truly without whom this event would not have occurred. Professor Outka is the Associate Dean for Faculty and William R. Scott Law Professor at the University of Kansas School of Law, Rock Chalk. Professor Outka's research centers on the intersection of energy law and environmental law. Her writing explores the legal context for a low-carbon energy transition with a focus on energy and environmental justice, renewable energy, and electricity generation. In 2017, her article, State Lands and Modern Public Land Law, was chosen as one of the 5 best works of environmental scholarship. Today, she will present on the topic of renewable energy siting for the critical decade. Please welcome Professor Outka.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And thanks to all the scholars who have presented so far. I appreciate the chance to share some closing thoughts on the issue of renewable energy siting, the point at which the broad energy aspirations intersect inextricably with local landscapes and local social and political contexts. Over a decade ago, I was taken with the Nature Conservancy's early work on what was then termed energy sprawl, the anticipated expansion, right? Thinking back to 2009, 2010, a good number of renewable energy portfolio standards had been enacted across the states, and there was an anticipation that there would be a significant expansion of land use for energy generation with the shift to renewable energy. And my research then focused on understanding and assessing the legal frameworks that would shape energy land use over the decade that we've now concluded. And it was clear that the shift to wind and solar power in particular would decentralize electricity generation and make energy feel increasingly local for more people across the country. It used to be more common to live out of sight, out of mind to the electricity resources or the nearest power plant. Though of course, as Professor Tomain rightly noted, many polluting power plants have long operated in close proximity to low-income communities of color. So that's been an enduring energy and environmental justice issue for the electricity sector. For many, though, the proliferation of electric generation facilities, small and large, across rural and urban landscapes, has made energy generation much more visible where it wasn't in the past. So let's take a moment to consider just how significant the growth has been for renewable energy over the last decade. And I think I'm just going to quickly see if I can do a new share, because I really like this graphic, where if you can see this, it's the Department of Energy Wind Exchange, and you can track it along from 1999 up to, the right around 2009, 2010, and then keep it going and just look at how the growth continues as we get closer to 2020. Very significant growth in, and this is just looking at wind, right? Just wind. So let's see if I can get this one back. Okay. So if we think that back around 2009, 2010, about 10% of electricity was coming from renewables. And at that time, a lot of that was legacy hydropower, had been in place for a long period of time. And today we have, close to 20%, coming on 20% renewable resources. And as this graph shows, the growth in wind in particular to date has been very substantial, and only recently has even surpassed hydropower as the leading renewable energy source in the United States. Just a couple of other graphics to give you a sense of what we've seen take place over the last decade. So we've saw a couple of these, great energy information administration graphics in Professor Power's presentation, but look at the significant point in time last year, 2019, when the EIA announced the United States renewable energy consumption surpassed coal for the first time in over 130 years. Of course, we know that a lot of the energy used in the first part of the graphic would have been biomass in the form of mostly wood, but we see this this arc and this really critical cross point between renewables and coal. One more is to show, okay, with all of this wind growth, we're now seeing regularly broken records and just extremely high renewable energy penetration on the grid. So just looking at the Southwest Power Pool, which is the area, the region in which Kansas is located, and this record of 72% wind penetration at a particular point in time. Obviously it rises and falls, but this is significant. And this is something that back 10 years ago, it wasn't uncommon to hear people question whether this was possible, whether this could be achieved. So aren't we doing great? Right? That's really the question. And the answer, I guess, would probably be yes, but no, right? Yes, but no. Quoting from the emissions gap report of the United Nations, and the same data is in the fifth assessment of and special reports following the fifth assessment of the IPCC, by 2030, emissions, and this is global, emissions need to be 25% and 55% lower than in 2018 to put the world on the least cost pathway to limiting global warming below that 2% or that 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius respectively. And Professor Powers shared some graphics that also showed that, but that's very significant. And the difference between those 2 degrees, there's a lot that's been written about that. If you're interested in it, especially students watching this presentation, there's a lot to be, that's not an insignificant difference, and especially in terms of the poverty implications and natural disaster implications that will harm and make life difficult for very many people between if we reach 2 versus 1.5. So I think it's a good time to ask, right? Is the current legal landscape For siting in particular, sufficient? And I'm saying that apart from other potential law and policy drivers, just thinking about siting at this point, is it sufficient to continue what we have in place in order to accelerate clean energy? And so assessing that legal landscape, we see, legal variability state by state that's largely unchanged over the last decade, even though we've seen that growth. The local land use authority and role, even where it's a state-centered siting regime, is also largely unchanged. Some changes, but largely unchanged. And so the significance of local governments and siting decisions has largely continued without a significant alteration over time. And let's see, this is moving, there we go. So I guess what I'd like to do in the few minutes that I have is highlight 4 areas that I think, I'll explore them in more detail in the paper, but where I think concerted progress can assist the goal of accelerating clean energy. Revisiting state and local roles. This is a very sensitive topic, and I don't in any way mean to suggest that it's even remotely feasible culturally or politically in all states, or that it necessarily is necessary in all states. But it is worth revisiting whether state and local roles are what they should be in each state. Responsible siting on public lands, a few words on that topic. Renewable and storage combinations, hybrid plants, and then offshore wind finally. These are a couple of areas that we could see some significant improvement over time. So first, just thinking about the issue of state and local contours. And in most states, as I said, we haven't seen a lot of change, but in at least one state just this year, it's worth looking at how one state has rethought what was the 1970s version of a centralized power plant siting act. And that's the state of New York and the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act of 2020. And this act's focused on renewable energy siting is a complement to the state's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which was passed last year and set very ambitious goals for the state: 70% electricity demand from renewables by 2030, 100% from zero emission sources by 2040, which essentially means renewable energy, nuclear, and as the primary generation sources. And so what this Siting Act does is dramatically change the structure for siting renewable facilities in the state of New York. It creates a new Office of Renewable Energy Siting within the Department of State. It creates a 1-year deadline for the state to hold 4 public hearings across the region, consult state agencies, and come up with uniform standards that will minimize environmental impacts of the facilities in a way that will eliminate that being created anew for every new project proposed. It creates exclusive permitting authority for 25 megawatts and above, and an option to opt in between 20 and 25. And it sets time limits to speed up the process: 1 year from a complete application to a final decision, and limiting that down to 6 months if a developer proposes a project to be sited on abandoned properties, brownfields, other contaminated sites, former mines, etc. The role of municipalities is different under this statute. The applicant has to consult before filing with the municipality, and there is a notification to the new office on whether there's compliance or non-compliance with local law. That existed under the prior system, but this strengthens the override provision for the state if the local restrictions are deemed to be unreasonably burdensome. The legislation also tries to address benefits to host communities by providing a mechanism for giving utility bill discounts and other benefits to be identified by the Public Service Commission and or with the applicant for communities that are hosting facilities, and also sets up a funding stream for an intervener and public participation account. I share this with you so that you have a sense of the kind of rethinking that is possible. I'm fully aware that in many states, the circumstances won't lend themselves to this kind of change necessarily. That said, even without a significant legal restructuring of state and local roles, it does seem that at this point in time, given the growth that's happened, but the acceleration that's needed, that there is more that states can do to work with and support localities as they're considering projects coming in. So this is one place that academia has been able to assist, and these are two just examples, sample recent analyses, where studies in the first case is Indiana, the second Ohio, one dealing with wind, one dealing with solar, but really trying to assess the economic impacts for local governments, local communities, as well as states, and assess whether the, how to maximize those and communicate that. So there's an educational function and a support function and a research function that can be collaborative between states and academic institutions. There's also ways to complement what have been, over time reactive siting regimes, just kind of a siting regime waiting for an application to come in and then just responding to that application rather than getting out ahead of it. So even without a restructuring of state and local legal authority over a siting decision, there is a lot that can be done. Planning for land reuse and co-use, planning where not to site. And I give you just the example of a recent effort by the Nature Conservancy to build capacity around this for states and local governments, developing models to enhance shared benefits and communicating in ways that counter misinformation that may be affecting community perceptions of renewable resources. Looking quickly to these other areas of potential growth, the public lands around 10 years ago, there was a big move to do programmatic environmental impact statements, identify solar energy zones, identify areas that should not be developed. And there's lots that can be critiqued about this process overall, but the siting and the progress in this area has languished over time. And so now in this recent report, the Wilderness Society and the Yale Center for Business and the Environment have highlighted that even in the areas that the Bureau of Land Management has already designated for solar energy or for renewable energy and as suitable, 700,000 acres have tens of thousands of megawatts of potential and are yet to be developed. So the leasing program and reinvigorating this area of renewable energy development is something that really shouldn't wait any longer. There's more that can be done here. And there are groups like Wilderness Society, like Nature Conservancy, like NRDC, who are at the ready to assist with identifying how to minimize the impacts on wildlife and natural systems. There is bipartisan support in the Congress right now for doing this. If you look at Senate Bill 2666, public land renewable energy development, it has a companion bill in the House and sets a goal for this very objective, 25 gigawatts of electricity from wind and solar and geothermal by 2025, which is within the decade framework that we are discussing primarily in this symposium. The bill would share revenues with local communities, set up a conservation fund, tinker with the leasing program to include it, et cetera. And this would build then on what is already a robust set of renewable energy projects, but there's a lot more potential there. Two more quick things, and I see Jenny is here, and I'm eager to start the general conversation and take some questions to our panelists. But thinking ahead to what kind of planning wasn't needed, what kind of siting issues weren't really extant over the last decade that are going to be more so going forward. And that is the hybrid renewable storage kind of facilities, both in the form of battery storage, which is what this graph is showing, the growth of combined projects where some degree of battery capacity and renewable capacity are being proposed together. But also, I think it was Professor Powers who noted the need for pumped hydro storage. Just this very week, Utility Dive was reporting that the pumped storage hydro is, something that is being revisited, and the siting issues for that are really significant. If they are on an existing water body, that's obviously raises a lot of environmental issues, but there's also alternatives, and siting and technology will all be a significant part of exploring that. Looking ahead to this decade, figuring out how can that be utilized and what are the land requirements for that, and the environmental impacts of that, how to get ahead of it is really important. And then finally, this has been going on for so long. So many other countries are so far ahead of the United States in offshore wind. Block Island Wind Farm, it's still the only wind farm that's commercially operating in the United States, 30 megawatts off of Rhode Island. That is going to change soon. So the Department of Energy is working with leases all along the Atlantic coast, some on the Pacific coast. And as you can see, this report from end of last year, late last year, has the support of the environmental community to show this is necessary. It can be done. It needs to be done well. Just like with public lands, there has to be responsible siting. But they're trying to show the way to do that. And the estimate of 2,000 gigawatts of technical resource potential for offshore wind is so sorely needed. So I'll stop there and unshare my screen, and very eager to take questions and share them with the panel. So feel free to put them in the Q&A. I also received some questions ahead of time from some of the students who were anticipating the presentations. And so if all of the panelists would like to join me now, I would be happy to begin discussing some of the questions from our audience. Let's see. So I have some of the questions in the
Jenny,
chat.
you stopped me, so my video.
Sorry.
I'm
Okay.
sorry.
It's all right.
Are you able to turn it back on?
I'll try. You cannot start your video because the host has stopped it.
Okay, I didn't press anything.
I
I'm
did
not
not
the host
press
of it, but we'll
All right,
get it
that's
figured
okay.
out to get you back on.
Not a problem. Thank you.
And let's see. So why don't we start with this? There's a question here. It looks like it's for Dean Kronk Warner, asking, with the limited resources that many tribes have, both employees and funding, should tribes focus their efforts on more small, quick steps that would benefit citizens within their own buildings, jurisdictions, reservations, or focus on bigger projects like the wind farm at Chilocco that Cherokee Nation's been working on for more than a decade? Would you like to answer that question?
Yes, of course. And Tara, thank you for the question. I really appreciate it. I think the answer is that there's not one uniform answer. It very much depends on where the tribe is in terms of their experience with renewable energy. Many tribes oftentimes, even if they have significant capacity for renewable development, may start with a small project just so that they can get the training and the capacity to grow that into a larger project. But some tribes are certainly already there and have the capacity to do larger projects. A great example, of course, is the Navajo Nation, which has its own utility, and so therefore is able to pivot more quickly and look at the larger scale development. So certainly you see both tribes on both sides of the spectrum as to whether a small or larger project makes sense for them. It just really turns on where the tribe is in its own experience.
I have a question that is directed to Professor Tomain. For Professor Tomain, after looking at your bio, it's evident you've been publishing works on energy law for over 20 years. What has been the most shocking shift in energy law? And do you believe the law is adept to address legal problems for energy use in the coming decade?
So that was awful generous to say 20 years. I started doing this in 1972 in law school. I think the biggest shock is the recent uptick. I never thought we'd see oil go up again in terms of our production. I thought we hit a peak in 1970, and around 2005, 08, we went up. So that was a surprise. I think that on the pleasant side, even though it's been slow, maybe I'm just being Pollyannish, but I mean, I think we have, in fact, bought into a clean energy transition. I think you see it more in the private sector with investments. Joel, I deeply appreciate your point about the retrenchment during COVID. That's something I was not aware of, but I still hope that we will, when we get back to normal, we'll see an uptick on clean energy investments on the private side. And as we know, there are state initiatives of all different dimensions, California always being the leader on this. And so if from my perspective, we are in a transition. It's going to continue. Federal leadership would really be highly desirable. So I hope that's responsive to the question. But thanks for the 20-year thing.
There's a general question that I'll just put out to everyone from one of our students saying, I'm curious about the presenter's thoughts on nuclear energy in particular. What do you think the future of nuclear energy in this country and the world will be, and what should it be? You want to start with that, Professor Powers, and maybe then Professor Eisen, go around. You want to share anything?
Sure, I'll say a couple of things, and then and I'm interested with everybody else's weighing in. I mean, the big thing about nuclear right now, in my view, is that new nuclear is so expensive, and it takes such a long time to actually develop a nuclear power plant that I think it's going to be highly unlikely that we're going to build big nuclear moving forward. And it's just not cost competitive. There's a plant that has been under construction in Georgia for, is it Georgia or South Carolina? It's Georgia. For about a decade. It was supposed to cost, I think, $8 billion. It's now at $22 or $23 billion. It's multiple years over schedule or behind schedule. And a lot of ratepayers don't even want to pay for it anymore. So new nuclear, I think, is going to be hard. Existing nuclear, however, I think it's really important for those places that already have existing nuclear to keep those nuclear plants online until other zero carbon resources can fill whatever gap they might leave. And there are several states that have basically developed a subsidization system for their nuclear fleet. And I strongly support that, because if we take nuclear offline prematurely, it's almost certainly the case that at least some of that capacity will get replaced by fossil fuels, and those fossil fuels will get locked into our energy system, perhaps for an untenably long period of time.
Yeah, how about you, Professor Eisen?
Well, I'm going to defer to Joe. I think he's been doing nuclear for as long as I have. I'm going to talk a little bit about let's let Joe weigh in on this, and then I'm going to say something.
I will be brief. I couldn't agree more about the Georgia plants. They're ridiculously overestimate and time, and they shouldn't be built. The ratepayers are going to hit it bad. I think what is interesting to me, and I am agnostic, but it's not new nukes of the 1,000 megawatt range. It's small mods, modular units. In fact, you even have Bill Gates has invested in it. And surprise, surprise, fusion is making a lot of news. It used to be a joke that every year you ask a physicist, where's nuclear fusion? They go, it's 30 years away. Well, now it's starting to get closer. It's going to be an expensive proposition, but something that we should look at. I am going to disagree with my dear friend Melissa on the subsidies. In Ohio, those subsidies were the subject of the bribe. And so that's problematic. But at the same time, that bill that got passed also took away renewable energy supports. So you had, let's switch the renewable energy supports to nuclear. That's not a trade that I would willingly make.
Can I just clarify? I was actually not talking about Ohio. I was talking more about the New York and Illinois, the zero energy credit system.
Yeah,
so, but yeah, point very well taken.
Yeah, Melissa, I'm on that brief with you, allowing the states to do it. Right? I mean, substantively, I thought that the states had every right to put these things in. That's the law. As a matter of policy, I'm skeptical that the candle is worth it.
Interesting.
I'm gonna echo what everybody else has said, is that nuclear at the moment makes up about 20% of our electricity generation. And so, and that percentage has been relatively constant. If you look at the nuclear line, whatever the color was in the charts that Melissa was showing, it's been relatively constant at about 20%. We're not building new big nukes. In my state of Virginia, Dominion has had a combined operating license to build a new unit at Lake Anna since 2017, but they have found that the cost is just going to be prohibitive. And I think it's fair to say that that plant, that extension, is never going to be built. On the issue of the subsidies, I don't want to waste a lot of time on this. I wrote a law review article on the New York and Illinois subsidies, but the technical challenge there was not so much the policy issue of whether the states should do this or not, but whether they were doing it in such a way that they were tying their subsidy to wholesale electricity market prices in a way that is impermissible as a matter of preemption under the supremacy clause. So that wasn't, I wasn't taking any position at all about the propriety of doing so. I think it would be very difficult, as the nuclear industry itself would tell you, to lose 20% of generation that doesn't produce substantial carbon emissions without having to replace that and putting us further behind in this upward trajectory with renewables. And so I'll echo Melissa and Joe in saying that, yes, we have to keep them around, and they're all too happy to let us know that we have to keep them around, but we're not going to be building big new ones anytime soon. The real action is in the small mod stuff that might happen sometime in the 2030s, as far as I can tell.
Here's another question, and I think this probably, it could be of interest to anyone. It's, what's your opinion on the recycling of turbine parts? So I guess thinking about the waste stream that could follow from expanded renewable energy. How do we balance the green energy and the harmful remains of the tools we use to generate it? Anyone want to jump in on thoughts on that topic? Sure. Professor Powers.
I'll weigh in just a little bit, because this came up in my renewable energy class last spring after there was an article that talked about the fact that as some of the older turbines are being decommissioned, one of the questions is, what do you do with all of the waste parts? And, you know, the first answer is that it would be optimal to have the wind turbine manufacturers trying to design turbines that can actually then be dismantled in a sustainable way, so that we're really thinking about life cycle resources more intentionally. You know, they do a little bit of recycling of some of the parts, but I guess the turbine blades are made of different types of fibers or particle board that is a little bit more difficult, fiberglass, excuse me, that is apparently more difficult to recycle. The flip side, so I think they need to address it. I don't know how, I'm not technically fluent in that area. But the only, I guess, counterpoint that I'll make related to the recycling issue, which again, I think needs to be addressed, is that we tend to often have these stories that focus on a single resource and its life cycle impacts, not often in comparison to other resources and their life cycle impacts. And to me, I think that the first thing that we should do is really do more of a comparative analysis and keep those updated as well. Because if you think about something like coal, for example, we have the emissions of coal, including toxic emissions like mercury and arsenic and lead. We also have the fact that there's a huge amount of waste that's produced from coal production that gets captured in pollution control facilities. And then the captured waste is called fly ash. And then we have to figure out what to do with that fly ash. And sometimes that fly ash gets recycled into things like particle board and wall board that then gets repurposed in homes and buildings. And there's some real questions about how safe it is. The waste gets stored sometimes in basically ponds that have overflowed and actually wiped out entire communities. So I don't mean to do whataboutism here, but I actually think sometimes when we just look at a single resource, we are not considering really a full comparative analysis that would help us understand the trade-offs. Trade-offs are inevitable, but I think we need a more capacious understanding what those trade-offs are.
Yeah, great points. Really, all of these ways of generating electricity have some kind of impact, but they're very different and we do want to compare them. Did others want to comment on the issue of waste? An interesting question from one of our alums. It's directed to Professor Powers, but I think it's kind of an interesting equity question that any of us might want to comment on. How to square environmental justice with beneficial electrification, which you discussed in your talk, thinking about the issue that the latter is in fully regulated IOU states has usually involved rate-basing electric vehicle infrastructure where all customers, including low income, are paying for infrastructure for expensive vehicles. This brings to mind to me an article by Professor Alex Klass where she compares the way that IOUs have responded to the issue of the equity issues presented in theory by solar panel net metering programs and the way that utilities have responded very differently to the ability to cover costs for new electric vehicle infrastructure. And I think that there is a disjunction there. Do any of you want to comment on that question? Whether beneficial electrification raises equity issues when the way that it's regulated.
Yeah, briefly, I think you've really articulated the problem. And net metering is the same thing, right? So you're going to reward people who have big homes and give them bigger discounts. And you know, I chaired a board with a guy who used to love to brag that he would fly from California to the meeting in his private jet and tell me that he had 1 mega solar power he was selling back to California public utilities. And I'm going, a nice carbon footprint and good for you, right? I mean, there are these equity issues. I don't have an answer. You know, if you're going to talk about tax policies that can address it, outright subsidies to low income people, I think those are sort of available ideas, but I think the whole point about the just transition, energy justice, environmental justice, goes exactly to that issue. And quite frankly, I don't think we have our heads around the problem other than trying to define it well. I don't think we have a series of solutions, and that's just my really untutored opinion about the topic.
Professor Eisen, would you like to comment on that in reference to your work trying to chart a clean energy research agenda, or an energy justice research agenda, rather?
Yeah, it's a little. Thank you for mentioning the article that I did with Professor Shelley Welton, University of South Carolina, on clean energy justice. We had 4 pillars there of what we thought energy justice might mean in the out years, and one of them is procedural advocacy. That is advocating, and Melissa said full spectrum advocacy, and I was thinking about that as you were asking me this question. The idea that people who have not heretofore been involved in the wonky and difficult minutia of the discussions at public utility commissions and legislatures need to be more involved there. As it turns out, I gave a presentation this morning to Vermont's symposium about proceedings in the legislature in Virginia this year to use utility refund money to give people COVID-19 relief. And one of the things that this question that you're asking me, and that experience in which I was somewhat involved, suggest is the problem is one for me of procedural advocacy. That is, getting people involved at state and local levels to do a better job of bringing up the sorts of issues that Joe and Melissa have just mentioned. And a lot of the things one of the things that's very different about the energy system is that much of what goes on, and you highlighted this in your own presentation, is state and local in nature rather than federal. There's a lot of federal advocacy in places like the RTOs, but a lot of what happens in energy happens at the state and local level. There's a question coming up about Chicago and the franchise agreement. I could sort of fold my answer in there, but thinking about what Joe said, thinking about what Melissa said, and thinking about what you said in your presentation, I think that the most important takeaway for me is that a lot of this is happening at the state and local level, and certainly in my home state of Virginia, there's almost nobody who is adequately prepared to deal with the traditional investor-owned utilities on their terms when it comes to issues like net metering and electric vehicle programs. And we're seeing this right now in implementing our own Renewable Portfolio Standard Act, which is brand new. The implementing regulations are basically being written by the utilities. So I'll stop there.
Professor Kronk-Warner, did you want to contribute on that point?
Yeah, I'll just generally add that on this question of clean energy justice, it's something that it's part of the reason why tribes are increasingly interested in renewable energy development. So for example, the Moapa tribe example that I gave, the tribe was very excited to have the solar and wind project come in because a traditional fossil fuel generating station had been in existence and it was swapped out for the renewable energy. And so the tribe was very excited to see the decreased health negative impacts of the renewable energy project versus the traditional negative health effects. Although it leads to this interesting balancing question of especially when tribes start to get into the large scale commercial, there are numerous examples of where the tribe itself isn't benefiting from the project and all of the electricity is being sold off site. So for example, in the Navajo Nation, there's still significant areas within the nation that exist and deal with energy poverty. And yet, as I mentioned in my presentation, they have this solar installation that's selling electricity and they're looking at larger development. So these issues are definitely ones that continue to plague tribes and issues that tribes are working through.
Yeah, it's interesting, the great points, and ties to some of the issues with utility shutoffs. We have a question. Dorothy Barnett's the executive director of Climate and Energy Project, advocacy group here in Kansas that works on clean energy issues, referencing, as Joel Eisen said, the recent news of mayor of Chicago using the city's franchise agreement with ComEd as leverage to end utility shutoffs, commit to ethics reforms, add clean energy. Thoughts on this strategy for a local government in terms of its work with an investor-owned utility?
I'll jump in on this one because I mentioned that I was going to handle this. I'm vaguely familiar. I've read a couple of news articles about the precise situation that we're talking about here with Chicago. What I can say from my own experience in Virginia is that it is extraordinarily important to use any sort of leverage that you have at the state and local level to deal with the massive political power that the investor-owned utilities bring to the table in situations like this. And the precise matter of relief for people who are suffering from the pandemic came up in the special session of the Virginia General Assembly. And there were a number of, I'm collapsing the discussion this morning, but there were a number of different proposals that were brought to the table, but most of them were swatted back by Dominion's political power. And so what I think is important in a situation like Chicago and ComEd is to recognize that something like renewing a franchise agreement is in fact a unique opportunity to bring to the table many of the issues that we're talking about here today. And I can see just from the one or two articles that I've read about it that it does indeed produce the sort of leverage that will at least bring a utility back to the table. We didn't have anything like that in the end in Virginia. We had the idea of trying to coerce a utility into refunding overcharges to use for COVID-19 relief, but in the end, that's not going to happen, even though the governor put his considerable political support behind it. So I hope that's an answer to the question. I mean, I think there's an opportunity for leverage there.
Yeah, and it does tie to, I think, what Professor Tomain you cited as some of the key influences at this particular moment on the discussions that we're having in the energy sector, the influences that connect to equity and ethics and the shift to clean energy. And I think particularly in the pandemic, the issue of utility shutoffs has been, forefront in the news. And to see an example where a locality is able to, because of just the timing of a franchise coming up for renegotiation, to be able to utilize that can give an example to other cities, though they may not have that same opportunity as you said. It's a point in time when that cycle comes to a conclusion. We just have a couple.
While we're on this topic, I wonder
Yes,
if I can ask my colleagues, this is news to me about ComEd, which I think is wonderfully ironic since they're the ones that started this whole ball game on cost of service rate making. Is the obligation for universal service any leverage in this attempt to treat people fairly on their rates? Joel, I think I'm asking this of you.
Obligation. I'm trying to parse through what it is that you're.
So we're redoing the franchise, and part of the deal is you have a universal service obligation. I'm wondering if that can't be used to address the economic problem. Maybe not. I'm just wondering what arrows we have in our quiver.
I'm thinking about the many times in which we've actually moved away from the common law duty to serve in other contexts. I don't think necessarily that's what our questioner was actually getting at. I think it was more the idea of renegotiating with this particular supplier at this particular time. I don't know. I'd have to think some more about that.
There's a couple of questions. There's one question that came in from a student that looks to the oil and gas industry to see, would it be fairer and more efficient to model compensation for wind turbines after the unitization system seen in the oil and gas industry. And I think that this gets generally at the issue of how to share the benefits more broadly across a host community, but then looking specifically at the legal concept unitization, which is, you know, akin to force pooling, but distinct from within oil and gas. From my part, I recall some, you know, a decade ago or so, there was at least one or two bills that I saw proposed in states to take some kind of approach like that. I'm not aware that any state has taken that approach. Wind is not regulated in the same way as oil and gas is across the states. Part of that is historical, part of that is specific to the resource, but I'm interested in where the question's trying to go, which is to that bigger issue of a fairness framework for maybe the neighbor who doesn't have the lease payments coming because of where the turbine happens to be located, and yet they're very much affected in their view shed and landscape by the addition of a wind farm in the area. Do any of you want to comment on sort of either that bigger issue of sharing benefits or the specific unitization analogy?
Well, I mean, unitization deals with depleting resources, right? It's a market prop. And so I see it as a way of just keeping prices up to a level that the owners happen to enjoy it. So I'm a little confused as to the connection between that and distributing benefits. I'm just lost on that.
Well, I guess I'll note that actually they've done some, it's not unitization, but the concept in terms of having some type of community benefit associated with an industrial activity in terms of wind generation has actually occurred in Denmark. And so there are a number of different private wind farms that have been developed in collaboration with the community, and then the community receives a share basically of the revenues earned from that wind farm. And it has overcome a couple of hurdles that we often face in the US in terms of, like Uma said, the idea that you're getting the profit, I'm getting the, change in my view, or I'm hearing the wind turbines, or basically some of the local impacts. The other interesting thing in Denmark is they have a prospective process by which when a wind farm is going to be developed, they basically allow and assume that there will be some type of property-based deprivation, and they have hearings where they adjudicate basically prospectively what the payment should be to everybody who's affected by those wind turbines. And that has also diminished the opposition to siting, because people know on the front end that they're not going to have to necessarily prove that they've suffered some harm. They do have to prove that they have some type of economic loss, but it's a relatively formulaic process to calculate that. And it's just another way of basically greasing the skids to make sure that things can actually get developed more quickly. But I'll also note that in Denmark, when I was in Copenhagen, they were doing a metro redesign, and everybody who lived near the area of construction and disruption was compensated, because the public as a whole was going to benefit from that subway, but only a discrete set of people were going to be impacted by the construction. So we could also do that, but we're so afraid of takings claims in this country that we are not often willing to make prospective payments as a matter of government policy.
Yeah, though there are individual developers that have come up with structures for arrangements like that, even if it isn't set in a legal framework. I think we just have time for this one more question, and referencing states, let's just go with this final question. What role do you think that state systems of government and state constitutions, especially where energy and environmental regulatory authorities are positioned in state government, affects renewable energy growth and policies? Given the states have been the the leaders in renewable energy development over the last decade at least. Would any of you like to comment on that role prospectively, looking to the next decade, 2020 to 2030?
Well, I think a number of us here have belonged to or intersected with a discussion that aims to reconceptualize the responsibility of the Public Utility Commission going forward. That thanks, Joe. There are some state commissions that have been extremely proactive in fostering renewable energy development. There's some that haven't. And it tends to be a very uneven landscape. And we've paid a lot of attention here in the past decade, but it's going to be a very long-term project to convince commissions that they actually have a responsibility to be proactive and foster more renewable energy. And I'd like to give a shout out before I let everybody else weigh in on this to state agencies that you don't necessarily think of as renewable energy agencies. These are agriculture departments and other places that have been at the front lines in trying to develop some policy. So it isn't always at the state utility commission level, but my focus, at least for quite some time, has been on state commissions and trying to improve their responsiveness to this ongoing challenge.
Great point. Yeah, did any of the rest of you want to comment on that role for states?
I guess I'll just say that as we're moving into what needs to be an electrify everything approach, I think there has to be a lot more interstate or intrastate agency coordination. And I also, in some ways, feel as though states need to follow a little bit of what they've done on the land use level and start to demonstrate a little bit more willingness to think about coordination and planning. And a huge amount of the planning that happens in the electric sector is devolved to the utilities, whether they're investor-owned utilities or they are, in Oregon, we have a number of public utility districts or cooperative utilities. And they plan for themselves more often than they plan for a system-wide decarbonization. And the more that we could have a better roadmap developed by the states, I think the easier it would be to address the issues of equity, to address the issues of land use siting, to address the issues of how multiple participants can play in the electric sector. So that's my take.
Yeah, great points. Well, we are at time and ready to conclude. I'll hand it back to Jenny Bartos, but just want to say once again, thanks to each of you for joining, and really a shout out to you, Jenny, for doing an excellent job at organizing this event. Also with thanks to Margaret Hare and Rebecca Clayton in the background, who've done a ton of work, and our trusty closed captioner. We really, really appreciate the work throughout this session. So thanks one and all. Jenny, final remarks?
Yes, thank you. First and foremost, I just want to echo what Professor Outka just said, which is to thank our just amazing presenters today for not only showing up and giving us your time, but also committing to write articles for us. So we are just so grateful that we've had this opportunity to learn a little bit more about your scholarship, and we look forward to learning even more. And again, thank you so much to Margaret, Rebecca, Ashley, the KU marketing and communications team as a whole has been huge in putting on this event. And, you know, if it was up to me, we wouldn't be on the Zoom webinar. It'd be much more clunky. So thank you to them. I do want to thank the attendees of today. You were fabulous with your questions and attendance. Thanks for taking this time. If anything the presenters said sparked an interest, you will be able to find all of their articles in the spring when our symposium issue does come out. And to stay up to date on that, you can either follow us on Twitter at Kansas Law Review, little shameless plug, or you could go to our website and we'll have updated information there. Last but not least, please, a huge thank you to our Law Review faculty advisors, Professor Laura Hines and Professor Christopher Hosel. And then obviously, thank you to Professor Outka. She is the reason, you know, we're all connected today. So thank you so much for being our faculty sponsor. And with that, we have concluded the 2020 Kansas Law Review Symposium. Thank you all so much for attending, and you can keep on updating on the symposium on the website. Rock Chalk.
Thank you so much.
Chuck, thanks everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Bye, guys.